Garcia has more than 40 years of experience, so it's very hard to try to summarize in a few phrases, in a few minutes, his vast experience. He is president of the Logos Institute for Crisis Management and Executive Leader. He's professor at the New York University since 1988 and in Columbia University. Next slide, Viviane. He's also a contract lecturer at the U.S. Defense Information School for the past 10 years. He's a senior fellow at the Institute of Corporate Communications at the Communication University of China in Beijing, and an international keynote speaker. But I believe, knowing Helio, as I think I know him, that in the next slide, we will see his favorite phase in terms of professional development and expertise. And it's that he's a very well-known author of 5 books on leadership, crisis, trust, and communication. There you have him, very happy with his sons. And he has up to now 11 editions. Is that right, Fred? 11 editions. Right. Of his
if you count the Chinese language, the Korean language, and the textbook Reputation Management is in its 4th edition.
Wow, it's amazing. Trying to summarize, as I said before, Fred's expertise in a few minutes, it's not fair, it's not accurate, but I have to introduce Fred with his masterclass today. So I give you Mr. Helio Fred Garcia with his masterclass. Thank you, Fred, for having us today.
Thank you, Gladys, and thank you, Association of Public Relations Professionals of Puerto Rico. I'm delighted to be here. I apologize that I have to do this in English. I do have some Spanish, but it isn't sufficiently robust to get the vocabulary that I need to use today. So I'm delighted that Juan is here to translate into Spanish. You can, at any time, communicate in the chat to Gladys. And if for any reason you don't hear what I have to say, or if my internet gets wobbly, or if I say something and it's confusing, and unless you clarify the confusion, it'll be difficult to pay attention, then reach out to Gladys. She has my standing permission to interrupt me. My desire is to make this as useful for you as possible. And if anything gets in the way, I want to address it quickly so that we can remedy whatever the shortfall might be. I'm deeply grateful, Gladys, for your introduction. You mentioned my work at my company, which is the Logos Institute for Crisis Management and Executive Leadership. And our mission at the Logos Institute, in everything we do, whether it's with clients or in our teaching or in our writing, is to build a better world by equipping people to become leaders who have the capacity and the desire to ignite and inspire change in the world for good. And I see my profession as being in the equipping business. I equip leaders to face into difficult challenges. I equip students to go out on their careers. And my hope is, from wherever you are, and I make no assumptions of where you might be in your career and in your leadership journey, I hope that today I can at least incrementally equip you at least a little better to exercise your influence with your clients, with your bosses, so that you can help them be better leaders, help them be better able to ignite and inspire change in the world. Today, I'm going to focus on something I've been preaching now whenever I get the opportunity for more than 20 years. And as Gladys mentioned, I've been doing this kind of work for the last 42 years. It simply means I'm old. But one of the things I've had the good fortune to do in these 40 years is educate and coach and mentor hundreds of public relations professionals who are my graduate students, who are my clients at big organizations. But also I've had the opportunity to have heart-to-heart discussions with more than 400 CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, with hundreds of senior military officers, with hundreds of religious leaders from all the world's faith traditions around the world, with hundreds of people who head complex organizations. And I notice patterns. And today I'm going to unbundle some of those patterns, and I'm going to share what I believe the profession needs to get better at. And I'm happy to have this become an ongoing discussion that you folks have among yourselves. If this can be catalytic in your own work and becoming a cohort who hold each other accountable for the work that you're doing, that would be a really good outcome. The biggest challenge that CEOs and presidents of universities and senior military officers and others complain to me about is they don't really understand the value that their public relations people bring to them. And when I try to unbundle why is it, there's a common set of answers, which I'll share with you in a moment. In today's session, I'm going to be sharing mostly my own original work, but not exclusively. And I'm going to share, in addition, the work of my dear, dear friend and mentor, a person that you should know, and I hope you get to know if you don't already know, and that's Jim Lukashevsky. Jim Lukashevsky is a fellow in the Public Relations Society of America, and Jim became my mentor 38 years ago when I saw him speak at a public relations industry forum, and I was intrigued and excited by what he did. And I asked if I could buy him a cup of coffee, and over coffee, I said quite aggressively, I want to do what you do, and would you teach me how to do what you do? And he said, well, I'll keep an eye on you, and if I think there's promise, I'll let you know. And then he began to test me. So I'd get a phone call and say, hey, I'm writing an article for the PR Strategist magazine. I need a sidebar of about 300 words on this topic. Could you write that? And when your mentor asks you to do that, there's only one answer. And that's, you bet, I'll get it to you tomorrow. And that began a relationship where I eventually recruited him to join the New York University faculty. He taught there for many years. We have published together. We have clients in common. He's now 80 years old. And at 80 years old, he went back to graduate school to get a master's degree in public policy advocacy because he wants to remain useful. One of the books he published, which is required reading in many New York University Masters in Public Relations courses, is Why Should the Boss Listen to You? The 7 Disciplines of the Trusted Strategic Advisor. This book was remarkably influential to me in my career, but I had the good fortune of getting the contents of this book before the book was even published, because Lukashevsky has been mentoring me for 38 years on how to become a trusted advisor. So when I say I'm going to be sharing with you my original work, it is deeply influenced by Jim, but there are moments in the book, moments in this session where I will quote directly from the book. And when I do, I'll have Jim's name on the screen so you can differentiate what is García and what is Lukashevsky. Now, this book is now in very short supply. It's been out for 13 years. Jim has asked me to co-author with him the next edition of this book. And our working title is Influencing Leaders. And it will essentially take the content of the book and some of my stuff that you're going to hear today and move it into book form for the next generation of public relations professionals to be able to influence their clients and their leaders. When I was first having coffee with Jim, he said, if you are to make a difference in the world, you need to be deeply attentive to a big problem in public relations. And he pulled out a napkin and a pen, just a cloth napkin and a pen. And on the napkin, he drew what I'm going to be sharing with you on the slide. He said, public relations people are really good at this. They are really good at looking at something and seeing something that most other people don't see or don't see easily. And as we look at it, we notice there's something really meaningful hiding in all of that. And we are really good at connecting dots. We are really good at processing what seems to be just random stimuli and developing an insight that allows us to see what is there behind the noise of those varied stimuli. Now, I see some people nodding their heads as I say this. Jim was not saying this is a good thing. Jim was saying this is a fundamental challenge for public relations people. And why is that? And that's because when we see the image through the stimuli, when we develop the insight, that is the result of intuition. And PR people are really intuitive. We are really good at, without knowing how we did it, coming up with an original insight. But Jim over coffee, holding up this napkin, said, but leaders of companies, leaders of governments, leaders of organizations are deeply suspicious of intuition. And they want to know how you came to that insight. And replying, I really feel that's what we should do, is not going to persuade. Now, they are not deeply suspicious of their own intuition, but they are deeply suspicious of other people's intuition. So one of the first things that Jim coached me on was, it's okay to develop the insight through intuition, but it is not helpful to present the insight as the consequence of intuition, but we need to do something else. And I will share in the course of our time together the something else that we need to do. Executives expect rigor. They expect critical thinking. They expect that you've considered multiple alternatives and have a really good reason for preferring one alternative over another. And that is a critical mindset that public relations people need to bring to their work, that we need to be rigorous in the way we approach clients. We need to be rigorous in the way we approach bosses. And we need to have the capacity to move them by meeting them where they are. And we can't move them if we expect them to meet us where we are. We need to meet them where they are, and they expect rigor. but physically it's often hard to meet them where they are because they're at a table and we are not. And one of the biggest complaints I hear from public relations people is public relations deserves a seat at the table. That the public relations perspective is critically important, and that calls on us to be at the table while decisions are being made. And Lukashevsky admonished me, and I admonish you, no, public relations doesn't deserve a seat at the table. We need to earn the seat at the table, not as a profession, but as individuals who bring value to the conversation. And getting to the table may not be easy, but what I hope to share with you today is a mindset, a set of techniques, and a set of tools that can get you more quickly and more robustly to the table if you're not there, or to more and better tables if you're already there. And I begin to reflect on, we deserve a seat at the table because the public relations perspective is critically important. While Jim was coaching me a long time ago, 38 years ago, I happened to read a book by Dr. Henry Kissinger, who had been the National Security Advisor and Secretary of State under Presidents Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. I happen to have significant issues with Henry Kissinger. I am not a fan. In fact, I had to sit across a table from him at a charity function, and I could not bring myself to shake his hand. I also would not embarrass the host by telling him what I really thought. But Dr. Kissinger is a very smart guy. And in his memoirs about his time in the White House, he said something that Jim called my attention to and that I now share with you. And Dr. Kissinger said, in any bureaucratic dispute, the side having no better argument than its hierarchical right is likely to lose. And that's because leaders listen to advisors whose views they think they need, not those who insist on a hearing because of the organization chart. So I would invite you to never tell a leader the public relations perspective deserves to be in the room while you are debating this. That is likely to be ineffective, but rather we need to become advisors whose views leaders think they need. So my session today is all about how to become that advisor whose views the leaders think they need. And then you don't need to ask to be at the table. You'll be invited to the table. And pretty soon, you're going to be at the table every time there are people around that table. So that's my starting point. One of the biggest challenges of becoming an advisor whose views leaders think they need is that public relations as a profession and public relations people often are marginalized. We are marginalized in a number of ways, but in my view, the primary source of marginalization is ourselves. We self-marginalize. We may not do it intentionally. We may not even do it with awareness that we are self-marginalizing. But when we self-marginalize, it becomes easier for others to marginalize us, for the lawyers to marginalize us, for other places in the company who are jealous of our budgets to marginalize us. That we make it easy to be marginalized when we marginalize ourselves. So we need to find a way to reverse that marginalization in order to become a trusted advisor. Now, why is it that we are marginalized? And how is it that we often marginalize ourselves? I believe it is because we are miscast in our role. And when we miscast ourselves in our role, that opens the door for others to miscast us as well. So how were we cast in our roles? Often we are cast as implementers of other people's insights. We're really good at executing communication. We are not necessarily understood to be the originators of those significant insights. But boy, when somebody has an idea, give it to the PR people, they can do wonderful things with it. And that's on its face complimentary, but that is a form of marginalization. Because however excellent we are at execution, and many of us really are, that's not what defines us. And that's not what leaders believe they need in the room. No, they can execute just fine. The other element of this is, even as we advance in our career, from account coordinator to assistant account executive to account supervisor to group head to managing director to wherever in the hierarchy of a PR firm or in a department we might be, we are still seen to be tacticians, that we are managers of other implementers. And again, we are better and better at figuring out how to execute other people's insights, but we're still not necessarily seen as the people with the insight. The other way that we are often cast by ourselves and by clients and bosses is we are cast as part of a functional area. He's a media guy. She's a speechwriter. She does internal communication. He is our social media guy. That we are seen to be expert in really narrow areas that aren't part of the central nervous system of the organization. And very often we get really comfortable in that role because we're really good at the media and we really like working with the media, or we're really good speechwriters and we really like helping leaders shine in front of audiences. But that is not seen to be a strategic function. It is not seen to be necessary to have at the table when important decisions are being made. So now that I've been all gloomy, let me offer some light. It is possible to break out. And Lukashevsky helped me break out. At the time I met with him, I'd been in PR 7 years, and I was really good at media. I was really good at speechwriting. But Lukashevsky said, that's not enough. You need to be more than that. And I have, reflecting on the 42 years I've been doing this and reflecting on Jim and others who have influenced me in my work, I believe there are 5 strategies that we can deploy in order to break out of the marginalized roles we find ourselves in and to elevate our role and elevate our work in ways that get us to and keep us at that proverbial table. So here are the 5 strategies. And I will send through Gladys a PDF of these slides. You're welcome to take as many notes as you want, but be advised these slides will come to you. The first strategy is to define our role more productively. And I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on how to define our role. The second is make predictions that come true. Now, the infamous New York Mets baseball player Yogi Berra once said that making predictions is hard, especially when the predictions are about the future. And we need to make predictions about the future. And we need to make predictions that come true. I'm going to unbundle that in some detail. The third is we need to never use the imperative mood, the mood of command. Do this, don't do that. One of the biggest complaints I get from leaders and bosses is my PR people are really bossy. They say, no, we can't delay. We've got to get this out now. We've got to return this phone call. And it infuriates me. Of course we can wait. No, we don't have to get it out now. No, you don't have to return that phone call. And that bossy tone for people who are not bosses talking to their bosses is one of the ways that we self-marginalize. So my advice is we never use the imperative mood. I'm going to coach you on what forms of speech are most productive, but do this, don't do that is not going to elevate us in our career. The fourth is to always speak in the boss's frame of reference with the boss's vocabulary. And in particular, this is a challenge I have with all of my newly graduated masters in PR students, is don't use that fancy public relations jargon you learned in graduate school. That's for us. But use common language. I often say here, use plain English, but use plain Spanish, but speak in a way that doesn't call attention to the public relations vocabulary, but rather to boss vocabulary or client vocabulary. And the fifth, putting all of these together, is to always give options. And with each option, have a clearly defined outcome. And the discipline is when you recommend which of the options to take, or when the boss decides which option to take, is to never make the decision based on personal preference. It's never, boss, which of these do you want to do? Or, boss, I recommend we do this. But rather to make choices based on which option leads to the best outcome or the least bad outcome, because I live in the world of crisis. So, boss, of these three options, the one that I believe gets us to the best outcome or the least bad outcome is this option. And we need to be habitual in always tying our recommendation to the foreseeable outcome. That's because we're really good at predicting the future. So this is the framework. This is the strategic framework that can help us elevate our own practice of public relations and be far more influential with our clients and with our bosses and with the organizations with which we work. So let's begin to unbundle these. First, we need to define our role better. And here's the signal challenge. Most PR people define themselves as communicators. We are great at communicating, and we communicate on behalf of you, boss. We communicate on behalf of the institution. We communicate on behalf of a cause. We communicate on behalf of a product. We are really good communicators. There's just one problem with that. And that is executives already believe they know how to communicate. They believe they're really good at it. They may be mistaken in their belief that they are really good at it. But if you define communication as speaking and reading and writing, well, they've been speaking since they were 10 or 11 months old. They've been reading and writing since they were 5, 6, 7 years old. They've done it their whole lives. They do it at home. They do it at the store. They do it with friends. Oh yeah, and they do it at work. But they believe that communication is essentially speaking and reading and writing. I'm really good at it, but I'm also really busy with important stuff. So I outsource the communication to other people, but I could do it just as well as they could. I just don't have the time or the desire to do that. Now, that casting essentially leads to marginalization because they believe that they are good at something. This is why our work product is micromanaged to a degree that no other work product is. There's no engineer who shows a schematic to the boss or to the client, and the boss or client picks up a pen and circles something, says, you know, I think this beam should be a little bit to the left. They don't do that, but they do that with our work product. That as soon as they get our work product, they pick up a pen and they start to work on our work product, and they think that they're really good at it. But in most cases, they're not. So the mindset shift is we need to be able to reimagine what we do as more than communicators. Yes, we have to be really good communicators, ideally the best communicator in the room, but we need to be seen as more than communicators. And in particular, because leaders follow the advice of advisors whose views they think they need, we need to become indispensable to leaders. And executives, whether in business or in other sectors, lose sleep because they can't answer two really important questions. Question one, why did they do that? Why did this group that really matters to me behave that way? Why are investors not giving us credit for innovation? Why aren't our employees working harder now that they have this new operating system? Why aren't our customers paying the premium price for the premium service? That executives lose sleep because they get frustrated that the stakeholders who matter to them are behaving in ways that are contrary to the way the leader wants them to behave. And we can answer that question. We can explain exactly why the investors are not giving us credit for innovation, exactly why our employees are not working harder even though they have a new operating system, exactly why our customers are not paying the premium price for the premium service. We can answer that question. We can also answer the second question that executives lose sleep over, and that is, how do we get them to do this? How do we get investors to reward us for innovation? How do we get our employees to work harder with this new operating system? How do we get our customers to pay the premium price for the premium service? That we are, of all the functions in an organization, we are uniquely situated to answer these questions. Now, the finance department can also answer questions about investors. And HR can also answer questions about, say, employees. And sales or marketing can often answer questions about customers. And the lawyers can probably answer questions about regulators. But we have unique standing of all the functions, and that is, it is within our domain to know the answers to these questions for all stakeholders. There's no other function in the company. There's no other function in the organization that has standing to know what matters to all of those stakeholders. That's our unique differentiation. And we need to seize this idea and build off of this idea. We can answer both of these questions, and we need to. Our role and our distinctive value proposition is this. This is the big takeaway of everything we're going to be talking together about today. Our distinctive value proposition, what we are rewarded for most, what we are valued for the most, is that we operate as applied anthropologists. I'm going to say that again. When we do our best work, and when clients respect our work the most, it's because we are applied anthropologists. Now, I came up with this metaphor that we are applied anthropologists just after I joined the New York University faculty in 1988. And being a new member of the faculty, I know that it's publish or perish. So I began writing a book about what PR really is. And I was really, really proud of myself for coming up with this idea of the applied anthropologist. But then I did something that I advise everyone to do before you write a book. I read a book, and I discovered that I had been beaten to that idea 65 years earlier. And to make matters even worse for me, I had been beaten by a professor at New York University. And that particular professor was a young man named Edward L. Bernays. And Bernays is famous as the first person to call himself a public relations counselor. He coined that phrase in 1919. But in 1923, he became the first professor of public relations at any university anywhere in the world. It happened to be at New York University. And when he joined the NYU faculty, because he knew it's publish or perish, the first thing he did when he became a professor was he published a book. And that book is called Crystallizing Public Opinion. It was published in 1923. And one of the books I'm working on, not the one I'm 3/4 of the way finished, that's on COVID and the US response to COVID. My next book after that is a re-examination of Bernays and the idea of applied anthropology. I'm finally going to get around to writing that book that I started back in 1988. But here's how Bernays defined public relations. He says, public relations is a vocation applied by a social scientist who advises a client or employer on social attitudes and on the actions to take in order to win the support of the public on whom the viability of the client depends. I think this is exactly the right definition of public relations. But I want you to notice what's not in this definition. There's nothing here about communication. There's nothing here about the media. There's nothing here about two-way symmetrical. There's nothing here about stakeholders except as society. That at its best, we are social scientists. We have a vocation. And we advise a client or employer on social attitudes and on the actions to take in order to win the support of the public on whom the viability of the client depends. That's what I do every day. That's what you do every day. And if we embrace this role, then we can begin to elevate the work that we do and the recognition of the value that we bring. Now, crystallizing public opinion continues to define public relations beyond that. And by the way, in 1923, the word anthropologist was not in common use. It was a purely academic word that was rarely used. It wasn't until the late 1930s that anthropology became a relatively common word. So my choice of words was not Bernays' words, but the idea behind it was precisely Bernays' idea. In crystallizing public opinion, he says the Public Relations Council is first of all a student. And anthropologists always begin with doing field work. They go out and they study the dynamics of the group that is their area of study. The Public Relations Council is first of all a student whose field of study is the public mind. The textbooks for the Public Relations Council's study are the facts of life. Here he did not mean how do babies come about, but the facts of life out in the world, the realities in the world. And we bring the talent of intuitive understanding. We have intuition, and intuition is good, but we bring that together with practical psychological tests and surveys. We need both the intuitive and the rigorously quantifiable in order to understand the public mind. He says our role is to discover what the stimuli are to which public opinion responds most readily. And we add to that a thorough knowledge of the principles which govern individual action and group action. And that requires a fundamental study of group and individual psychology before the Public Relations Council can determine how readily individuals or groups will accept modifications of viewpoints or new policies. I invite you to read Crystallizing Public Opinion. It is still in print, costs $20 on Amazon. It is the foundational book for our profession. And Bernays is all about anticipating what it will take for a group of people to feel something they otherwise would not have felt, or to think something they otherwise would not have thought, or to know something they otherwise would not have known, in order to do something they otherwise would not have done. This is our distinctive value proposition. So again, we understand public opinion, and public opinion is the product of individual minds. The individual minds collectively make up the group mind. We use all of the practical means of gauging the public mind. In 1923, the universe of tools was limited. By the way, Bernays is also the founder of the science known as demographics. And here's a really interesting anecdote about Bernays. Bernays, as a young man, was a student at Cornell University, and his major was biology, and his preferred field of study was entomology, which is the study of insects. And back in the early 1900s, entomology was not a very advanced field. The study of insects was still in its infancy. But Bernays discovered something. If he had an insect with which he was not familiar, he could make predictions about that insect's behavior, what it eats, where it lives, what its predators are, how it defends against the predators, how it mates, how it gives birth to or lays eggs for the offspring. He said, I could predict what this unfamiliar insect will do if I know what other kinds of insects it is like. And he began to notice that if he could find insects that were kind of sort of like that insect, he could get an insight into that insect itself. And the more he tested this idea, the more it seemed to work. And then he wondered, can we do that with people? Can we do that with people? If there's someone I don't know, but I know about them, who are they like, whom I really know really well, and then I can make predictions about them because I know how the people they're like are likely to behave. That's how Bernays began to develop this idea that became the practice of public relations. He said, we use all of the practical means of gauging the public mind, the research campaign, the survey of a particular group or state of mind, for confirmation or modification of our own intuitive judgments. So again, he's not saying intuition is bad, but it isn't enough and it isn't persuasive. So we do the research not only to give us an insight, but for our clients and bosses to know that this is a rigorously developed recommendation. So again, public relations is a vocation applied by a social scientist who advises a client or employer on social attitudes and on the actions to take in order to win the support of the public on whom the viability of the client depends. I have my graduate students memorize this phrase. In 21st century talk, that is applied anthropology. And our role when we do our best work is to be the applied anthropologist. And here's the work of the applied anthropologist. We diagnose the social relationships and the power relationships within groups and among groups. We understand the expectations of the stakeholders who matter to us, and we understand what matters to them. We understand how stakeholder decisions are triggered and how stakeholder behavior plays out. We predict the impact on the things our clients do, the things our clients say, or fail to do, or fail to say, and the impact of all of that on trust, on reputation, on competitive position. We understand what will happen if we do X, or if we do Y, or if we do Z. And then we execute. Then we mobilize resources to protect trust, to enhance trust, to protect reputation, to enhance reputation, to protect competitive position, to enhance competitive position. But it's all done because of our unique capacity to understand what matters to the universe of stakeholders. That's applied anthropology. With those insights, we then move to the second strategy that builds off of the first. And that is, we make predictions that come true. And as the bosses begin to recognize that we can accurately predict what will happen next, they begin to see us having value they didn't previously appreciate. So what do we make predictions about? We make predictions about the behavior of groups. If we do X, here's how this group is likely to behave. If we do Y, here's how this group is likely to behave. If we do Z, here's how this group is likely to behave. And the discipline is, when we make that prediction, even if the boss or the client doesn't follow our advice, we register that we made the prediction, and then we revisit that prediction after the decision has been executed. And it's as important if they don't follow our advice as if they do follow our advice. But when we revisit the prediction, we need to be really careful not to gloat that we got it right and they got it wrong. That's a marginalizing behavior. So when you give the options with outcomes, as we're going to learn in a minute, and say, boss, of the options available to us and the outcomes that each of those represents, I believe the option with the best outcome, with the least bad outcome, is option number 2. And the boss says, yeah, you may be right, but I want to go with option number 3. There, instead of saying, no, you can't, because that's the imperative mood, say, well, we can certainly do that, but let's be sure we do an after action assessment so we can learn if it works, great. If it doesn't, we'll figure out what we could do differently next time. In other words, let's make this a process of continuous improvement. Unlikely the boss will say, no, I won't. But then when the boss follows his or her own intuition, because they believe in their own and not ours, and it goes really badly, or it fails to go well, when we get together again, say, well, we were worried that that might be the consequence. We had two other options available to us. Let's learn from that. And let's see if something like this happens again, whether a different approach might get us a better outcome. And if we do it that way, we're more likely to get another opportunity. But in particular, even when they don't take our advice, they see that we accurately predicted the future. And that's what really matters. We are seen to be reliable and then indispensable. And leaders have confidence in us and our advice when we are seen as competent. We're really good at what we do. When we are seen as able to deliver, and in particular, when we are seen to be able to predict and to influence outcomes. We influence outcomes. Third strategy, avoid the imperative mood. The imperative mood makes us sound bossy. Do this, don't do that. You can't say no comment. We have to get this out now. As I said before, that infuriates bosses, that infuriates leaders. So how do we give advice? Here's something I learned from Lukashevsky that I've developed on my own since then, and that is we give advice by asking questions, by asking a certain kind of question in a certain order. So here's Lukashevsky. One of the most important roles of the trusted strategic advisor is to ask constructive questions that help broaden the leader's own understanding. The question asked the right way broadens the leader's understanding, and it moves processes and decisions to the next level. So over the decades, my firm has developed a technique for giving advice by asking questions. And it's in three parts. We call it the Q cycle. It begins with asking open-ended questions of a certain form and in a certain way. It then moves to having the client or boss choose among interpretive options. I'll unbundle that in a moment. And then it moves to us playing back what we have heard and get validation of it, or playing back what we had expected to hear but didn't hear. And the boss will say, oh, yes, that's right. I thought you said the problem was mostly with our investors, but you've been talking about employees this whole time. Have I misunderstood something? Oh, yeah, you're right, investors. Let's talk about investors. That form of question expands the boss and client's thinking. So let's unbundle this.
Fred, yep. Quickly, could you move back to this slide with the framework? Because under open-ended, under the first step, we cannot read what the copy.
Oh, the last word in open-ended is question.
Okay, question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So here's the form of open-ended. Exactly what are we hoping to achieve with this? Can you tell me what you think the biggest challenge will be in making this happen? So how will your team be different in a year if we begin to implement this? And It's open-ended. There's no wrong answer to an open-ended question. Another open-ended question is, well, which of our stakeholders are the most important in this initiative? And it's intended to get the client or the boss to begin to share with you their thinking. And what it often does is it identifies gaps in their thinking and gives you an opportunity to help them fill that gap. And after you've done a number of these questions and you begin to develop an insight, it's then important to invite the client or boss to reflect on the possibilities of what he or she said might mean. So when we're done, will success be measured by revenue gain or by more customers? Which of those is more important, the dollars or the people? And it's that forcing the boss to choose that helps the boss cement his or her thinking. Do you see this problem as primarily with investors, or is this problem primarily with employees? And get them to prioritize in their minds. Is your team motivated more by pride in work well done or promotion and advancement? If you force the choice, they are more likely to come with you. And then we play back what we heard and what we didn't hear. Sounds like your priorities really are the investors. Is that right? I hear that you're focusing mostly on this. Do I hear you correctly? In other words, are you saying that the employees don't matter? Oh, no, I didn't mean that. Great, what did you mean? And then they begin to share more. Let me tell you a story, just looking at the clock, yeah, I have time. Let me tell you a story about, do you have a question, Gladys? Go ahead. You're muted.
You're okay with the timing.
Okay,
Take
great.
the time
Thank
you
you.
need.
Okay, so one of my clients is a giant pharmaceutical company. And I've had the good fortune to coach hundreds of the executives in that company over 30 years. And about 7 years ago, I got a call from the speechwriter for the president of one of the divisions. And I'd worked with that division president for many, many years, since he was just a sales manager, earlier in his career. But at this point, he was the president of this important business unit of this giant pharmaceutical company. And I knew the speechwriter very well. She's a really good speechwriter and a really good person. And she called me. And I will modify the guy's name simply to protect the privacy of my client. So let's call him Jim. So the speechwriter says, Jim asked me to get you on the phone and invite you out here. They were in the Midwest, and I'm in New York. Invite you out here because Jim's giving a speech on Thursday, and he wants you to rehearse the speech with him. And I said, Jim doesn't need me to rehearse a speech. Jim's really good at giving speeches. Are you sure that's what he said? And she said, yes, Jim wants you to come out here to rehearse a speech. I said, okay, I'll be out there tomorrow. And I get to the company, I get to the giant conference room, and there's a speechwriter. And on the table are 3 stacks of documents. One is a speech about 20 pages, Helvetica, 18-point, double-spaced. Another is PowerPoints by themselves, and another is PowerPoints with notes. And she's got them all assembled, and she's very proud of her work. And she and I are chatting, and we're sipping coffee. And then Jim walks in. He barely looks at the speechwriter. He shakes my hand, and he plops down in the seat right next to me. And he says, you know, I really don't need help rehearsing a speech. I've got a different problem. I said, oh, tell me what's going on. He says, this speech I've got to give, I think it was a mistake to say yes to the invitation, because I think I'm walking into an ambush. I think I'm going to be the designated villain at this conference. It was about pharmaceutical pricing. And I just want to think it through with you, because it's too late to pull out of the conference. That'll cause a lot of attention. but I want to make sure that I'm going in there fully prepared. And so I did the Q cycle. I said, okay, what are you hoping to achieve at this conference? And he began to talk. And I asked, well, why did you accept the invitation in the first place? And he talked. And what are the different ways that you might engage differently? And he talked, and we talked for a long time. I then turned to, so are you saying that this is more about the price, or is it more about a broken system? Are you saying that it's your company in particular that's being targeted, or is it all big pharma that's being targeted? And I just used the hypotheticals to get him to refine his thinking. Then I played back what I'd heard, and then we did this iteratively. And I never gave him advice. But after 2.5 hours, he smiled and he stood up and said, I know exactly what I'm supposed to do tomorrow. The speechwriter, who'd been silent this whole time, says, would you like me to write it up? He said, no, I think I've got this. Thank you. And he walked out the door. About a year later, Jim was promoted to CEO of the whole company. Not because I was his advisor, but because he was really good at his job. And he's a really good CEO now. His name is not Jim. And he was able to recognize he needed help thinking. And I was on his radar as the advisor whose views he thought he needed. But I want you to notice also just how marginalized that speechwriter was, that it would never have occurred to him to ask the speechwriter about how to protect himself in that conference. So that's the power of asking questions as a way of provoking thinking. Fourth, always use the leaders. That means we have to be applied anthropologists on our leaders, on our clients, on our bosses. We need to understand what matters to them. We need to analyze the kinds of concerns they face, the kinds of decisions they make, the kinds of pressure they are under in order to be able to advise them meaningfully. And then we need to frame all of our interaction in terms of the leader's perspective, the leader's concerns, using the leader's vocabulary. Here's Lukashevsky again. The counselor's prime directive is always to look at the questions, the issues, the opportunities, and vulnerabilities from the leader's perspective first, and to test all advice against that leader's perspective. Lukashevsky concludes this approach leads to better, more usable advice more quickly. We also need to use the leader's vocabulary and never use PR speak. We don't use the word message. We don't use the word audience. We don't talk about the mechanics of the communication, the press release. We talk about the people who matter to the boss in this instance. We talk about the things those people need to hear you say, boss, or read about, boss. We talk about their needs. We talk about it in non-PR jargon. We keep sentences simple. We use simple, easy to understand words. We don't use PR words like impressions. We don't talk about clicks. We don't talk about the mechanics of communication to the boss unless asked. But we always strive for the boss's language when we're addressing the boss. Here's the fifth and the last, and the one that actually leads to overcoming that marginalization once you've done the other four. And that is bosses, executives all know that there's always more than one way to do anything. There's more than one way to do anything. And if you make a recommendation and the boss asks, what else did you consider? And you haven't considered anything else, then you're marginalized. And they are unlikely to take that advice. But here's the good news. Doing nothing is always an option. or doing nothing out of the ordinary is always an option. So the reporter says, I need the request, I need the answer in 10 minutes. And you go and talk to the boss or talk to the client, doing nothing is always an option. So when the boss says, well, tell them no comment. Well, that's an option. So let's project. If we say no comment, or if we just don't return the call, here's what is likely to appear in the paper. Here's how those who matter to us are likely to interpret what appears in the paper. What appears in the paper is going to be very bad. And we're not going to have our point of view in that paper. But it is an option, and it's one we ought to consider. Doing something modest is always the second option. So in addition to not returning the call or saying no comment, we could call and answer the question or decline to answer the question, but then give our point of view. And under the conventions of journalism, most of the time, if we're the subject of the story and we've given them a statement, they have to publish at least part of that statement. That means that even though the story will be negative, at least our point of view will be reflected in that story. Doing something big is always the third option. So here's the consequences if we give them a statement. The third option is, let's get in front of this. Let's get the word out to all of the people who matter to us before they read it in the newspaper. So let's communicate more broadly, because we then have the first mover advantage and we can control that story. But if we wait for it to appear in the paper, we're going to lose control of that story, and a bunch of people who matter to us are going to be contaminated by that view, and we won't have the opportunity to change their minds. Giving options with outcomes leads to better and smarter choices. We need to understand what is the predictable outcome if we pursue each of these three options, and note that the predictable outcome could still be an unintended consequence. So very often I hear, no, that we did that once before and a whole bunch of things happened that we didn't anticipate. Just because you didn't anticipate it doesn't mean it wasn't anticipable, that you could have anticipated it. And part of our value, because we're applied anthropologists, is to anticipate the unintended consequences that are still predictable. The discipline is to never use personal preference as a reason to choose anything. That if you say, I think, I feel, I believe 2 is the best option, you've lost. But if you ask the boss, which of these, boss, do you want to do? You've also lost, because now the boss is going to make a decision based on something other than the outcome. So we always ask, which is the best outcome, which is the less bad outcome? And when we're done with the whole cycle, we revisit, were we correct that the outcome we predicted came to be? When we do this, and the other 4, we break out. We are no longer marginalized. And I feel really bad for the speechwriter in that room. She's a friend of mine. I like her a lot, and she's really good at her job. But she was marginalized. And there was nothing I could do about her marginalization in that room. But if we define our role as more than the communicator, but as the people who possess an insight into why the stakeholders who matter to the boss behave the way they do, and how to get them to behave differently, then suddenly we're advising the boss on things the boss cares about. We need to make predictions that come true about the behavior of those groups. And again, per Bernays, we study the public mind. We do research into the groups. We have a keen understanding of individual and group psychology and the triggers of behavior. In other words, we're anthropologists. We avoid the imperative mood, and we give advice by asking certain kinds of questions in a certain order in order to provoke thinking. We use the boss's frame of reference, so the boss is with us as we're giving that advice. We give options with outcomes and always choose based on the best or least bad outcome. We do all of those things. We become a trusted advisor. And leaders and bosses begin to see perspectives that they would not otherwise have seen. We are then understood to trigger their thinking, which is why Jim asked me to go all the way out to the Midwest, because he needed a partner to think with for 2.5 hours. Leaders begin to see us as part of the outcome, as contributing meaningfully to an outcome, and not just as part of a process. They begin to trust our counsel beyond whatever functional area we may fill. So I know many brilliant speechwriters who are at the right hand of the CEO in every meeting. I know brilliant media people who are at the CEO's right hand in every meeting, but they're not there because they're speechwriters or media people. They're there because the boss knows that they make better decisions when that person is with them. And we get invited to the table more and more on more and better issues, and our work becomes even more rewarding. So I close the way I began, and that is leaders listen to advisors whose views they think they need, not those who insist on a hearing simply because of the organization chart. So my admonition to you is to become an advisor whose views leaders think they need. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Gladys.
Thank you, Fred. Amazing presentation with insights and recommendations and valuable views from Edward Bernays and other leaders and people to follow that people inspired us. So I don't have any questions so far, but I have a few notes I would like to share with you so you can expand on. First, and very important, we are having our second masterclass with your mentor, Jim Lukashevsky, as I told you. I think it's planned for the end of May. So be attentive. We will be sharing information on that.
Hey, Gladys, could I comment on that?
Sure. I will share with you the date, and you're most welcome to join us on that session.
Yeah, I'll be a heckler.
He will be talking about his most recent book, The Decency Code.
Great book, and you'll see that I have a blurb on the back cover. Great
Perfect.
book. I usually end my semester with my public relations graduate students this way. Edward L. Bernays was teacher and mentor to a guy named Chet Berger. Chet Berger was teacher and mentor to Jim Lukashevsky. Jim Lukashevsky was teacher and mentor to me. I am teacher and mentor to you.
You are.
And now the solemn burden falls on you to not break that chain.
We accept the challenge. We feel the pressure on our shoulders. And that's why we as senior consultants and practitioners want to have wonderful practitioners and experts like you available to them so they can grow their development and reach their practice. So great. My second comment on your presentation.
I'm sorry, just one more thing, Gladys. The good news that you're going to hear from Jim directly is you can cut out the middleman. Now, okay. Jim is teacher and mentor to you. So you're only 3 steps removed from Bernays himself.
Yes.
That's even cooler.
My second comment on your excellent presentation is that you have a commitment to come back to us to present us your book on Edward Bernays that you will be publishing hopefully next year.
Hopefully in 23 on the 100th anniversary.
Okay, yes. So you have a commitment to come back to us and present us that book as well. Then my other comment is that please, it is important to stress the difference between outcome and output. Outcomes are objectives based on change in terms of attitudes, behavior, knowledge, or opinion, while outcomes are tactical results. And we should be focused on outcomes, not in outputs. So you
Yeah,
did
outputs are
mention
the
the
things we
outcomes.
do. Outputs are the things we do.
Exactly,
We write a press release, we send it, it gets published. That's an output.
exactly.
But the outcome is people trust us more, or people buy our product
Exactly.
more.
And that should be our focus, outcomes, not outputs. We are strategic advisors. We are not technicians. We are not tacticians. And that's the move and the message that we're trying to get across. That's the reason why behind your presentation and the reason that I chose that topic for you to begin with, because we're having the opportunity and the privilege to have you at our annual convention with a second masterclass that I encourage everybody to attend as well. So I have another comment. Although in 1988, you came with the distinctive value proposition of calling ourselves applied anthropologists, and later you discovered that Bernays 65 years ago basically described your concept. It is amazing to me, not only that Bernays had that vision of advance so early in the past century, but that you so early in your career as well discovered such a deep concept and a strategic role in our profession, which we are still encouraging and emphasizing in our colleagues. We are not communicators. We do deal with communications in our field, but we are strategic advisors. I love Bernays' definition of public relations. The one that we encourage to use is the one that is proposed by the Universal Accreditation Board, which is kind of in the essence of what Bernays said, but it's more general. It says that we are a management function that establishes and maintains mutually beneficial relationships between the company, the brand, or the service, and the publics on whom its success or failure depends. So basically talks about public, talks about the strategic advisor and the management function, not the technician, not the communications mentions at all. Great. So I do want to give you credit for the Q cycle. It's a framework you did develop. It's very interesting to me. Kudos for that. Very useful for our career. Very useful to deal with business leaders and with top management that, as you mentioned, they believe they know. When they reach out to us, they believe they know how to communicate. They believe they do not need our assessment. And we have to justify our position in that table. Yep. Do you want to comment on that as well? Because I know you have advised top managers and CEOs from all over the world, in all continents.
Many leaders who believe they're good at communicating are not. Some really are. And one of the things I advise my graduate students and my clients is you need to make it your life's work to be the best communicator you can possibly be, and ideally the best communicator in any room you're in. And we can help others become better communicators as well. But the communication function is essentially the cost of entry into the profession. But it isn't what's going to lead to the most impact in one's career. And as I said, the bosses, whether they're really good at it or kind of good at it or mediocre at it, they think they're really good. And we need to change the frame. We need to change the mindset of the leader about what our work is. And the more we focus on the behavior of stakeholders in the future, the more we unlock the mystery that the CEO or the boss or the client is baffled by. And we can first explain it and then say, oh, that makes sense. And then we can prescribe, if we want them to behave differently, here are the ways that we can make that happen.
Fred, we have a question from colleague Iris Rivera, which is APR as well. Do you think the digital era puts more pressure on our labor as advisors that are supposed to provide immediate solutions? How the research and analysis process could be affected? So those are two questions.
And that's a really good question. As with any tool, there are pluses and minuses of the digital revolution. One is, as we witnessed, for example, in COVID, which I'm writing about now, is that misinformation travels really, really fast and goes very far and very deep in a heartbeat. But on the research side, we can find things really fast. We can get something like situational awareness pretty quickly, and we can use the digital tools to connect with the people who matter to us, even as misinformation about us is circulating out in the world. So I see the digital tools at people's disposal now as essentially just the most recent iteration of communication technology. I think it changes in the execution and in the speed and in not only the velocity of getting the message out, but the velocity of people sharing that message. But I don't think it fundamentally changes our role as the strategic advisor. And our role as the strategic advisor is to be fluent in the dynamics of what happens in the digital world, but to go beyond the digital world.
But it's certainly the digital era and the digital tools generate greater expectations and pressure on the speed on which we have to respond to that.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's the core principle in crisis management. The first 24 hours are crucial into responding and getting into across your message and your conversation and your voice. And the first hour within that 24 hours, it's crucial as well. I know you have another lecture focused on that you'll be giving during the convention. I don't want to get into the specifics, so we can save that for October.
Yep.
But it's interesting, and you'll be expanding on that. I will not get into the details. Another comment I wanted to share with you is that you mentioned that we need to speak the boss's language. And that's very, very important because we need to be business literate as well. We need to know the business, the boss business or the client business from the inside out to be able to talk about profit, loss, to talk about the business language and what is important to the boss. If we come into the table talking about PR concepts, as you mentioned, we're getting the manager's lost and we are going to miss their attention. Very good point.
Yeah.
And I wanted to give you credit as well for the 5 recommendations you are posing, you are presenting for us to be invited to the table or to secure our place at the executive table at the C-suite. So that's your formula and your recommendation that's attributed to you. And that's great knowledge and expertise and savviness and learnings from 42 years now, Fred.
Yeah.
You've been
getting old.
a consultant, an author, professor, university professor, and keynote speaker. So we are, it has been such a great presentation, and I've been reading comments on how interesting is your vision of the function of the anthropologist, the public relations practitioner as the anthropologist, as an anthropologist, I may say. I'm writing Norma Colon, APR, comment here. She says, speaking in the business leaders language has been my message to our colleagues for the last 5 years. So great insights. I don't have any additional comments. We are in awe. We are very thankful for your time, for your knowledge, and to, in a way, reciprocate what you have done for us at the Puerto Rico Public Relations Association professional import. We would like to give you a certificate naming you honorary life fellow. Vivian, if you'd like to.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, it is
Wow.
signed by our president, Jose Baez Morales. And that's a way of showing you that we appreciate how committed you are to the development of our profession, to our colleagues at the association. You said yes from the get-go once I contacted you. You have been very kind, very patient. You are offering us a second lecture during the convention. So that's the way we say thank you. We feel that you are part of our organization, that you are a great mentor and inspired us to go the extra mile. So we are honored to recognize you as our honorary life fellow for your commitment and to promoting the profession, and to our practitioners, and for raising the ethical standards of the public relations profession. So I believe we're going to be sending you this certificate by mail. Okay. And if I have to go to New York to give it to you by hand, I will be glad to go to your office.
Come on.
And do so, and thank you personally, because you are a giant and a trailblazer, but you are also very committed and humble, and we do appreciate and value that, Fred.
Thank you, Gladys. I'm touched, deeply honored, and can't wait to come to Puerto Rico myself.
Oh, wow.
Again, I love Puerto Rico. I've been there.
You are most welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
You're most welcome.
Let me also thank Juan for making my presentation accessible to those who prefer to hear it in Spanish. Thank you, Juan.
Our translator, he's great. He's great. So great feedback from the session is still getting in from our colleagues. Moving on. Thank you, Fred. Until next time. I know that you have plenty of other things to do because your agenda is not easy and you're going to be traveling in May. So a big hug from Puerto Rico, and thank you. Thank you.
Abrazos. Thank you very much.
Abrazos.
Bye-bye.